As it's Boxing Day, our national holiday devoted to lazing about in our underpants, I thought it might be appropriate to send out into the world a little message in a bottle to my fellow travellers on what I call the lazy left. Not that I expect many, if any of you, to actually be watching this live, but maybe it'll be clipped up and the random algorithmic currents of social media will drift it up upon your digital shores. Now, the reason this doesn't apply to any of you watching this live, wherever you are on the political spectrum, left or right, is because by virtue of your presence, you've already illustrated a willingness to engage and question and be open that eludes my target audience for this message. So feel free to give yourself a little congratulatory pat on the back. And just for reference, where am I on the political spectrum? Well, it depends on who you ask. Isn't that how it works nowadays? I consider myself left-wing, but those a bit further to my left would say that I'm a centrist. The far left call me right-wing. And I reckon most of you are probably centre-right, which according to those same people makes you Nazis. Whereas the far right call me a Marxist. The thing is, to my understanding, traditional politics at its simplest level comes down to how to distribute resources fairly. And I'd argue fairness is that most quintessential of British values. Just look at our reverence for queues. Why? Because they're a particularly singular representation of fairness, and woe betide anyone who dare break that societal contract. I'm looking at you, Holly and Philip. What that all means then is that our different positions on the political spectrum is determined by what precisely we as individuals consider fair. Is it fair that a young man can illegally come over here from a safe country and be housed for free in a nice hotel whilst a British homeless person shivers in the street? Is it fair that a family who helped our country and have been tortured because of that are at risk of being murdered because they have no legal route to asylum here? Is it fair that for some people to cynically exploit the benefit system and not contribute to society? Is it fair that the benefit system doesn't properly provide a safety net for someone who's worked their entire life? Is it fair that foreign companies can buy our country's assets, plunder wealth from them rather than investing, and British citizens are forced to pay more for substandard services because they have no alternative? Which is why I think the water companies and rail companies should be renationalised as soon as possible. I know, how dare I have such a disgusting far-right position? Now, with that understood, let me lay out my message then to any left-wing people watching this output for the channel from the first time. As a fellow lefty, here's my insight into what I've learned my last 2 years inside the belly of the beast that is GB News. Everyone's pretty nice. That's it, there we go. I have attended marches against Nigel Farage, but then you meet him and you know what? He's a charming, polite guy. Ditto Jacob Rees-Mogg. I doubt we're going to be popping out for a pint, but on the left, you build up these people to be the devil. And when you actually engage with them, when you actually listen to their positions, for the most part, they're just people who have a different idea about what's fair. Now, that doesn't mean I agree with them on many issues. I fundamentally disagree. But I do think that they are being fair. And here's the thing. Those people on the right, perhaps because they've been told that they're the baddie, have to read more and they have to think more, which makes them very good at justifying their positions. Whereas we on the left, because we tell each other, and this message is backed up by most of the media and cultural institutions, that we're the good guys. And if we're the good guys, you know what? We don't need to read and think and justify. We just assume that we're right. And that was me, right? I'm being a hypocrite here. I was on the left. I didn't need to think. Whatever position my fellow political travellers took must be the right one. I didn't need to read or think until suddenly I did. When anti-Semitism started cursing through the mainstream left via Corbyn's Labour, I knew that that just wasn't right. And most of the left ignored it or just flat out denied it. Because, hey, we're on the left. It's impossible for us to be wrong or worse, racist. So I had to go away and read and learn and argue and persuade. And then when I realised that if the left could be so fundamentally wrong about anti-Semitism, if just by virtue of being on the left doesn't make you automatically right, what else could the left have got wrong? And I started seeing mostly left-wing women, mostly lesbians, being on the receiving end of outrageous abuse and even violence because they didn't want biological men in their spaces. But wait, They're left. The left were going, these women, they're actually bigots, they're transphobes, they're TERFs. So I read and I learned and I listened, I made up my own mind. Now, of course, it's fair for trans people to be treated with respect. But is it fair for female prisoners to have to live with biological male rapists and in some cases even be sexually assaulted by them? Is it fair for female athletes to train their entire lives and lose to biological men who only recently were mediocre male athletes? The Achilles heel of the left, which far-left cranks and gender ideologues and critical race proponents and whatever else you want to loosely define under the umbrella of the culture wars or woke politics, have expertly exploited in our desperation to be the good guy and then not actually put any work in to be able to justify our positions. Apolitical issues have been made political, but anti-Semitism, women's rights, and the response to COVID and debanking and October 7th and on aren't left or right issues. You can't just go along with whatever your side tells you. You have to read and question and think and learn and decide for yourself what's fair. You have to put the work in. You have to stop being the lazy left. Because for those of us who do want and are fighting for and arguing for a better world, it's just not fair. Right, let's get the thoughts of my panel. We have journalist and broadcaster Linda Duberly. Hello. We have journalist and broadcaster Benjamin Butterworth. And we have journalist and agony aunt Hilary Freeman. Benjamin, I'm going to go to you first because I remember watching you online and sort of screaming at my phone. And here we are now, a couple of years later. I believe we're friends. I like you a lot, yet we disagree on stuff.
Yeah, I think there is a temptation, and I don't accept that it's just people on the left. I think plenty of people on the right do this too.
Exactly.
Where they like to see the world along tram lines, and they decide a set of ways in which they perceive political questions, and then they adjust the world around them to fit the straight line that they've already decided upon. And I think that's the real problem that modern politics have. I spent my Christmas with what I would call gays and strays, and one of them there, middle-aged gay man, was telling me about how he'd, in the previous days, had all these arguments with his niece, who is quite left-wing and was talking about how much she hates Israel and is supporting Gaza and the Palestinians. And he was trying to say to her, but you don't understand, they would throw your uncle off a building if they got the chance. It's just not that simple. And I thought that was such a sad sort of indictment of the situation where this young person was clearly unable to appreciate the complexities. And the reason I say that is because maybe the first time that you saw me was a couple of years ago arguing with Piers Morgan about gender identity, and I haven't particularly changed my views, but I do look back on it and I realised that I sort of started with a straight line and then adjusted the arguments against it. I just sort of ignored to adjust the world around me. And I think that's a mistake that social media has whipped up in recent years, and that's the big problem with our politics.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, Linda, you're nodding along to what Benjamin's saying here, and I agree, absolutely, this sort of cognitive dissonance is a left and right issue. I guess the reason why I specifically wanted to address the left is that the difference might be that the left feel, this is just my experience from being here, is that don't seem to put as much work into their arguments in terms of what they sort of, and I'm talking about not because people here are engaged anyway, but I'm just talking about out in my life.
Yeah.
They're just like, I'm a lefty. I'm talking about on the comedy circuit. You think even the right as well?
Everyone.
So you think it doesn't matter?
I think so many people are really, really lazy about how they develop and formulate their opinions. They just don't get under the skin of various stories that come up. One of the problems we've got with society today is this polarisation. And it's not between left and right. It's between X view and Y view. I mean, I listen all the time on the radio to, for example, to a court case that I might know quite well, that I've got some background knowledge about. And often the anchor, say it's on LBC, for example, well-known radio station, will be going hell for leather about a certain point that I know is really, really unfair because no one on that programme has taken the time and the trouble to do the actual research, get to the raw data, get to a few facts and properly construct an opinion. It's lazy people, I'm afraid, in general, left and right. I
agree with that. I mean, look, we're here as sort of the idea as, I guess, political commentators somewhat. We're more engaged than most. Do you think, Hilary, that the situation is even more exaggerated in people's personal lives? They're just like, I was raised like a Labour or a Tory and that's how I'm going to vote for the rest of my life?
I think people just aren't interested in facts anymore. It seems to me bizarre that I remember when the internet came about and they thought, God, you're going to have every fact in the world at your fingertips. And people ask questions or argue points that you could just Google and it would come up with a page and it would tell you all the facts and the history, and people aren't interested. You try and argue with someone and you give them the facts and they're like, well, that fact goes against my opinion, so therefore...
It's not a fact.
It's not a fact. And that is the problem now. People do not accept experts, they do not accept facts. I think that's something that started happening with the whole Brexit debate.
So it's why I do a lot of...
It became about feeling,
and I do a lot of
fact.
Communications training, for example, for the emergency service, where it's really important that they get a firm grip about what's going on in the media landscape. And the problem I said to them now is that you've got actual conventional news gathering, which goes on. It still goes on. It doesn't go on to quite the same extent as when I was a young trainee on the Western Mail in Cardiff doing 3 years of indentures. But it does still go on. But there is wall-to-wall opinion. And opinion is not fact.
Yeah.
And now younger people have got used to this and they recite opinion as though it is fact. And when they do get a fact, they think it's a movable feast.
But also we have a problem that people think a disagreement with you makes it personal.
Yeah.
And I think
that's the other thing.
I think that's a real shame because, I'm 30, so I assume I'm the youngest person here. So maybe it didn't used to be like this.
I'm 28.
I don't. I self-identify as 28. But when you say that you passionately disagree with someone, you try to argue the corner, they think it's a personal attack. And that's an utterly redundant way to go about having a democracy.
Exactly. You need to be rational. You need to have rational debate. I mean, I've got 3 kids. One of them is your age, which makes me feel really old. The other 2 are a little bit younger. But the oldest boy is an economist. And, I couldn't have a conversation with him without him looking up some stuff on his phone, sending me links, because he's trained to do it. I have the most interesting conversations with him, because it's like with Patrick Christis a couple of days ago, we were talking about young white guys getting grants because they're one of the most compromised groups in the education system in this country. Now, within days, he had gone to the Resolution Foundation, he had gone to different government departments, he'd got loads and loads of facts lined up, which gave him a really good perspective on the actual problem. And I think that's really important.
I'll just say one other thing, which is that I think we've also been rewarded, as it were, with politicians who've taken advantage of this. I think we have a problem with demagoguery. I would give the examples, some viewers might not like it, but I think Boris Johnson liked to whip up the idea that disagreeing with some of the things he did meant that you were attacking a type of person, a type of understanding of Britain and British culture. And I also think, to an even worse extent, Jeremy Corbyn did that. That's why you got this situation whereby a man who is blatantly anti-Semitic and supported by obviously anti-Semitic people was able to deny the blatant reality because any questioning of the evidence of that in front of them meant that you were no longer on the left or no longer Labour, that you weren't good enough for their purity. And I think we live in a politics of purity tests that actually is very different to how it used to be 20 years ago.
And also politicians deal with a kind of marketing speak. They go on, they get on air, they give you their soundbite, and it's not really deep enough. It's not thought out enough.
It's all about personality, isn't it now? It's not about, you remember the days of people like Michael Foot. Can you imagine him being in politics now? I mean, he would never get anywhere.
Not sure he should have been in politics then.
However, he was, he had a certain authority, a certain knowledge. It wasn't about image with him. It was completely the opposite, wasn't it?
So does anybody have an idea about how to break this, how to move forward?
Oh, it's very difficult because partly it's 24-hour news that's done it, partly it's social media that's done it. Well, I mean, we've got to get used to the fact that in this election, in particular, we are going to have to start reading manifestos. We are going to have to start understanding policies because our vote will count.
People taking responsibility is the point.
They have to be responsible.
Because my whole life up to this point has just been following, as we were saying, following our side. And now we have to break free of our tribalism.
Yeah.
I think seriously, you've got to start paying journalists more and making journalists...
Well, you would say that, Hillary.
Yeah, well, I would say that. But seriously, there's this idea that anyone who has a blog is now a journalist.
Yeah.
And, not properly trained, just writes their opinion. And so therefore, that means a knock-on effect is that people don't trust actual journalists who are trained and have got experience.
Yeah.
Because they see them as being the same as some blogger who's just decided to write their opinion. So I think those things, would help, because if people can't afford to go into journalism because it's not a viable career that pays your mortgage, then you are just going to end up with people who just do it because they've got a trust fund.
I mean, I personally wonder if facts are going to make a comeback. If what's going, no, seriously, what Benjamin was saying, it's about people get so offended because their opinion is what's being challenged. But I wonder if now we're going to somehow get over ourselves, toughen up a bit, and finally facts might.
Well, we're coming
re-emerge.
into election year.
We'll see.
We are going to have to step to the plate. Everyone is going to have to step to the plate.
But then it looks like it's going to be the dirtiest election we've ever had. The mudslinging from, Labour claiming that Rishi Sunak doesn't want to lock up paedophiles, then claiming that Keir Starmer, when he represented cases as a lawyer, that was somehow his personal opinion, despite that not being how being a lawyer works. This suggests that it's going to be a very ugly political
But I'm
year.
optimistic because I hope that people, as they get more and more used to this stuff and they see this stuff, they get savvier to it. I'm hoping, optimistically, that they might then actually start thinking for themselves. But we'll see.